Hello, Aline. It's really nice having you on my podcast. I'm a
Hi.
long-term fan. I've been following your work for years, a little bit even before you started interviewing IO. So it's a huge honor for me to be able to have you here and to pick your brain a little bit about hundreds of questions that I would like to ask you. And every single one of them will take a probably entire podcast all by itself to answer, but hopefully we'll get to as many as we can. Before I shoot all my questions at you, could you please just tell the listeners who might not know what interviewing IO is, who might not have heard from you before, what is that, what you're doing, and what's the value proposition for software developers there?
Of course. Thank you. That's an amazing introduction. So, hi, everybody. My name's Aline. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Interviewing.io. Before I started that company, I was an engineer for a while, and then I worked as a recruiter for a few years to kind of learn what it's like to be a recruiter. And having been on all sides of the table and having experienced those firsthand, I was just frustrated with how bad hiring was. It's bad for engineers. It's bad for the people trying to hire engineers. It's bad for recruiters, bad for engineering managers. And I started Interviewing.io to try to make it better. So I think the biggest problem with hiring, there are a few, but the biggest problem is that it's massively inefficient. You have companies chasing candidates, but they're kind of chasing the same few people, right? Recruiters, when they're trying to hire, usually go on LinkedIn, and then they say, show me all the engineers who have worked at Google in the last 5 years that know Java. And that's not a good way to hire people because, one, just because they've worked at Google and know Java doesn't mean that they're a fit for your role or that they're good. And our data, in fact, shows that it does not mean that.
We will definitely dive into this data.
Awesome. And those are the people that every recruiter is contacting. So your odds of getting a response are really low. So all of these companies are doing exactly the same thing over and over and kind of expecting different results, and it doesn't work. And then in the meantime, there's this long tail of candidates who haven't worked at Google and don't know Java or whatever the skill is that they're looking for, who are excellent. You know, I graduated from MIT. I think I'm a decent engineer, but in the course of my engineering career, I worked with a lot of people that were, without question, much better engineers than me. One of them dropped out of college. Actually, the best ones, I think, all dropped out of college now that I think about it. And they didn't drop out of MIT necessarily either, right? So it doesn't feel right. And that's why it's inefficient. And the thing that I think drives that inefficiency is that everybody's over-indexing on resumes and pedigree. So everybody says that, right? I don't think anybody thinks that resumes are a good way to hire. Mm-hmm. But in the absence of something else to tell you who's good, that's what you have to use.
Yeah, it's like a democracy. It's a really bad way to govern, but it's the best
everything
one
else
we
is
know.
worse.
Yeah.
Exactly. So we created a platform for software engineers where they could practice technical interviewing anonymously. And when I say practice, I don't mean do puzzles or asynchronous coding challenges like you might on LeetCode or a HackerRank or something like that. I mean that you actually get an anonymous mock interview with a human being from a top-tier company who's very, very experienced. So that's what we built. We built this platform where anybody could get on and get paired with senior engineers from the kinds of companies where they'd want to work, get a very realistic mock interview, and then get actionable feedback at the end. And that feedback actually serves two purposes. The first one is you get feedback, so you know what you need to work on.
Feedback is something that most developers just crave after technical interviews, but never get.
It's a black box, right? I mean, hopefully you know if you passed or not, but you never know why, right?
Exactly.
A lot of the time, the reasons you think you did well or the reasons you think you did poorly are not at all the actual reasons. And people are generally very bad at gauging their interview performance anyway.
And so companies are very hesitant of giving back this feedback, even if you ask.
Yeah, they don't because they're all afraid of getting sued, and it's bullshit. Like,
That's the reason? Really?
That's yes. I mean, there are two reasons. The first one is they're afraid of getting sued, and the second one is that they're afraid of people getting defensive and just having to deal with it because they're not equipped deal with it.
That's what I always thought, because I asked when I was interviewing, I asked several times for feedback and I never got one. And I thought that people just don't want to give me feedback because, well, maybe out of time constraints and maybe just, it's not pleasant to give someone feedback when they haven't passed the exam.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's a learned skill to actually give feedback when somebody fails. It's something that we don't really coach our interviewers on how to conduct interviews because we only hire people that have done hundreds in the wild already at companies with high bars. But one thing that none of them know how to do when they start interviewing for us is give feedback in a way that's useful and constructive. So when we do onboarding, that's what we focus on. Yeah,
and on interviewing IO, everyone gets feedback.
Everyone gets feedback. That's the value prop, really. Well, so that's half of it, right? So you get feedback. Half of the purpose is to give feedback to engineers who are craving it. The second purpose is for us to use that data to figure out who the strongest engineers are based on something that's much more objective than a resume, and that is aggregate interview performance. It's not performance from just one interview, right? It's performance from a series of interviews. And, you do a few and your aggregate performance starts to converge on reality a little bit. So once we know who the strongest engineers are, based just on their anonymous interview performance and nothing else, then we actually connect those people to the companies where they want to work. So we have a portal where less now than when hiring, like this is a terrible time for hiring. I think we all know that everything is a little bit slowed down. But even now, we have, I'm not really allowed to say, but like the companies where listeners probably want to work, we have them in our portal. There are a few from some big acronyms, let's put it that way. And they trust us because they know that our candidates are really good. And if you do well in practice on our platform, you can just click a button and say, get me an introduction to a decision maker at this company. And we just get you an introduction. So you don't have to know people that work there. You don't have to try to like weasel your way in or like find somebody that can give you a referral. So we do those two things. We help people get better at technical interviewing, and then we help top performers get into, it's not true yet, but we want it to be any company they want. And today it's already a nice selection of companies.
That's absolutely amazing. Sounds amazing. And frankly, I would like to discuss with you not the Interviewing IO platform, even though I encourage everyone to go and look at it, but the blog post that you write. I will kind of give the context for the listeners to understand why I'm so excited to have this opportunity to ask you some questions. But before that, just in the context of Interviewing IO, I kind of think that every interviewing or career or whatever advice should be contextualized to a culture and location. So my question would be, Interviewing IO, is it primarily focused on US market, or you also support some international stuff? And if you are focused on US market, do you offer the second part of your value proposition to candidates who might want to work remotely in the US companies?
Really good question. We are primarily US focused right now, with a few exceptions. We're also open for business in the UK. We're open for business in Canada and Mexico, and then a few other countries. The countries that we're open for business in are the countries where you don't need a brand new, what's called an H-1B visa to work in the US. That may change as remote work gets more and more common. Even though it is now, I don't think a lot of companies have caught up, and I don't think that their visa hiring practices yet reflect the new reality that we're living in. I hope that we'll be able to open up everywhere at some point, but for now we are primarily US-based.
Okay, that's a very important clarification. And can I practice, can I enroll and practice on your platform as non-US based software developer?
Depending on where you are, Probably not if you're not in one of those countries where, you don't, like US has labor agreements with a few other places like Chile and Singapore, but right now you would unfortunately be waitlisted.
Yeah, great. Well, I think it's totally fair because you are focused on practical aspect. You want to help companies find candidates. So you are not just offering some random service of practicing. You are actually focused on the results. So it makes sense. And that's why where my question comes from. I hope that maybe after this podcast, I can talk to you and get some backdoor access, maybe.
Sounds great. Yeah, we have this ability. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. So just for you folks who listen out there to know that the stuff that we're going to discuss is primarily sourced from the US, even though I think that most of it is applicable to, well, at least to my country, to Israel, where I live, because it's just struck a nerve when I started reading your blog post. It's so accurately describes my experience. And
I think like anything we say is probably applicable to any country that is sort of a tech outpost for US-based companies. So Israel, has a big Google office, right? And a bunch of other tech companies have offices there too. The reason I say that is, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not that well-versed in the market, let's say in the EU, but interview styles at companies like Google are very different than interview styles, I think, at a lot of other tech companies. So companies like Google tend to focus primarily on data structures and algorithms as part of their interview process. Whereas I think in a lot of places in the EU, the focus is more on what you've done and about the idiosyncrasies of specific technologies or programming languages. So that's a very different interview style. I'm not going to say which one is better, but our platform is especially tuned to the former, namely like data structures and algorithms that are usually technology agnostic.
Yeah, and you're just fast forwarding me on my list of questions, but let's just get straight to it.
Okay.
Would it be correctly... Okay, so every engineer, especially the ones who, like myself, have troubles with these brain teasers, because I constantly black out and
you lose consciousness? Okay. Okay. No.
I bombed so many technical interviews because they would ask me this algorithmic question about ordering something or measuring something, and I consider myself pretty good engineer, but when I'm being asked these questions, I'm lost. And sometimes after the interview, I can figure out the answer, but not during the interview for some reason. And I'm very good at being managed under stress, but these questions, they just throw me off. So I thought about it, like why so many companies do that. And one of the answers is that it's easy to standardize, right? These types of interviews. But I wonder whether maybe these types of questions are just some kind of a proxy for IQ tests. What do you think about that?
So I think that first I'll talk about the reason that companies do it, and then I'll talk about whether it's a proxy for IQ testing and ultimately how effective it is. So standardization is one big reason. The other reason, and this is related to standardization, is that you can think of it like a factory assembly line, right? And one of the big, I think, innovations of the Industrial Revolution was this idea of interchangeable parts, right? So you're not just custom making every part of a pipe or a shoe in your house. You're just making a lot of copies of the same part, and then they all just kind of fit together. And I think that these large companies view their supply of interviewers as interchangeable parts. So if you have a standardized set of questions and a very standardized process, it's very easy to train up all of your interviewers on it. And then it doesn't matter who's conducting the interview in theory, right? If somebody's not able to do it, you swap in another one. It's not different from team to team, right? So you can really scale a hiring process. And
especially for international companies like Google, like you mentioned, right? That they would like to standardize that across geographies and cultures. So go figure how to do that. But these brain teasers, they are kind of relatively simple to pass along.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think the reason that these companies stick with this approach is not because it's the best approach, but because it is scalable and because it's better than flipping a coin. And it really just has to be a little bit better than flipping a coin, because these companies have, I said assembly line earlier, I'll say it again, they kind of have this assembly line of candidates, right, that always want to work there.
Exactly.
And you can treat these people like shit, right? And they'll still keep coming because there's so much prestige that comes with working at these companies and so much money. And for many people, getting that job, especially if they come from a non-traditional background, that's the stamp on their forehead, where for the rest of their life, when somebody looks at a resume, they'll be like, oh, they worked at Google. They must be smart, right? So
definitely,
it's such
a life-changing event.
Life-changing event. So people are willing to jump through a lot of hoops. And as long as your process is just a little bit better than random, you will make the hires that you need to make. And if you have the money to run an inefficient process, and maybe it's not worth it to you to make it better because you have that assembly line of candidates, that's good enough. I think the problem is that a lot of smaller companies that don't have the same resources and brand power and prestige and ability to pay salaries just cargo cult these processes. And they're like, well, this works for Meta, this works for Google, this works for Microsoft. They have great engineers. If I do the same thing, I will also have great engineers. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work like that. I would say that these large companies have great engineers despite their processes, not because of them, right? The reason people are attracted to these companies is the scale of the work and all the other reasons, right? It's not for the process. So that's, I think, a big problem in our industry.
So now, what works for the big major companies doesn't necessarily work for smaller companies and startups.
That's exactly right. And, a lot of alums from FAANG will go and start startups, and that's all they've ever known. That's where they learned everything. So they will bring a lot of those practices with them when they start a company. And they bring a lot of the same biases because that's all they've ever been taught. You asked earlier about whether these are proxies for IQ tests. I'm going to answer this not with, I'd like to answer things with data when I can. Here, I don't have data, so I will just speculate. This is my opinion. Personally, I think that there are a lot of similarities. I think that, one of the things about an IQ test is that if you test a large enough population, the scores will end up on a bell curve, right?
Yeah.
They're normally distributed. I think that the same thing is true, probably, of technical interviews. On our platform, not as true because it's a self-selected portion of the population that's very motivated to do better. But I think in general, if you were to test every engineer in the US, let's say, their performance would probably fit on the bell curve. I think that these interviews can be good. I think that what really matters is not the question that's being asked, but how good the interviewer is. If you can put a terrible question in the hands of a great interviewer, and they're probably going to get a lot more signal, and they'll probably get good signal. Whereas you can architect the perfect interview question and give it to a terrible interviewer, and they're not going to get any signal at all. And what separates bad interviewers from good ones is, in a lot of ways, how engaged they are, how experienced they are at asking the question, and how much they view the interview as a collaborative exercise rather than some kind of adversarial thing where they're just waiting for a reason to say no.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the reason that these interviews get a bad reputation is that it is an assembly line of interchangeable parts, right? These companies are pulling in interviewers who don't really want to do it. We have found, we've had thousands of interviewers on our platform over the last 8 years, and we have found that whether you like interviewing or not is bimodal, right? It's this, either you love it or you hate it.
It's like teaching in some sense.
Yes, it's exactly like that. And if you hate it, you should just never be part of an interview panel. And it's not fair to the people that love it because they get to write code less, right? And they have to get interrupted and conduct interviews. But if you hate doing it, and a lot of people that do it hate doing it, and they do it because and they're not rewarded.
I know many of them.
Yes.
For them, it's like a it's like a hell. And they complain constantly that,
Yeah.
I spend 20, 30, 40% of my time, especially the higher ups, like principal level, when they need to spend days or maybe weeks assessing other potential principals, which is not like one interview, it's like an entire process.
Yeah, that's
and
a
he
serious
says like,
process.
half of my time goes into this thing and I don't like it, I hate it, but I must do it.
And the really messed up thing is there's no incentive to really do well, right? Your compensation and like how good of an interviewer you are does not go into your promotion packet.
Maybe even the other way around, because what you are assessed on is like productivity building stuff, and the interviews just take away from that.
Exactly. So the incentive structures are all wrong. So no wonder these interviews are kind of a terrible experience. I think that at the core of it, the purpose of a technical interview is to see if the person can solve problems with code. And that's a reasonable thing, right? All you're doing at work is solving problems with code. But when it turns into this farce where your interviewer is half paying attention, they don't want to be there, they're going to ask you a question, and over time, and interviewing IO in some ways is part of the problem, the practice industry has become kind of this like military interview practice industrial complex in a way, and the standards keep going up because there are all these people that have memorized every question on LeetCode.
Yeah.
So if you get a smart person that is actually a great engineer but has not practiced, they're going to fail because interviewers want to fail them because they're like, fuck this, I want to get back to work. And two is now they're so used to people answering like this because they've memorized everything that they don't take the time to like give good hints and collaborate with the person. So it's a problem. This is a really serious problem in our industry.
Game theoretical problem, right? That a race to the bottom or something. But
exactly right.
I would just like to say, just my hunch, right? I haven't used interviewing IO. Again, we will get back to it after we record the podcast. But just my hunch is that actually interviewing IO can help solve, address, mitigate this problem and not exacerbate it, because the attrition of the interviewees who don't like interviewing is in part because they need to do it so much. So theoretically, anything that can cut the number of potential candidates is just a blessing for them, because then instead of like having a bad recruiter who gives you like 20 candidates a week to interview and none of them passes, that's a nightmare situation to be at. So anything that can cut this number by any factor is a blessing. And I guess interviewing IO, with your ability to have insight into individual performances across time, I don't know if you track this metric of your success or how you track even that metric, but just like intuitively, I would say this sounds very promising. Something
like 60 or 70% of our active users end up getting the job they want, whether it's through us or not. And of the ones that really practice intensely, that number is closer to 85%. So we do track those. Now, everything you're saying there, I 100% agree with. The only thing I'll add is, and I'll let you in on our master plan here, I think interviewing, the state of interviewing is really, really bad. And we want to fix it. But if no one's heard of us, and we try to change how interviews happen, we're just going to go out of business, and that's going to be the end of it, right? We can't try to affect change when we don't have the mind share that we need to affect change. So our master plan is to get enough. Yeah, exactly. So that's the long game. And the nice thing, and the reason this isn't just speculative, is when we onboard our interviewers, we don't really train them, like I said earlier. We don't tell them what questions to ask. So that we trust them, and if they don't do well, we fire them. Like basically that's our process, and we're pretty ruthless about it. So
you fire interviewers? How do you say to the company, like let's say Microsoft, sorry, this employer will no longer be able to interview?
Oh, we've done that before a few times, but I was referring primarily to our practice interviewers, right? We pay them money to conduct these interviews. They're contractors for us. Okay. But we don't tell them what questions to ask. And that's really, really important, because it creates kind of a biodiversity in our question pool. Yeah, a lot of the questions end up being similar to the kinds of questions that the FAANGs ask, but not all of them. And we have a many-to-many relationship between, candidates and interviewers. Like the candidates who practice get matched with different interviewers, and each interviewer gets matched with a ton of different candidates. So over time, we're able to take a look at a given candidate and say, all right, what was their outcome? Did they have a good outcome? And then we can retroactively look at how they did in their practice interviews. And these interviews are all going to differ a little bit in the material and the style. Some will be more practical, some will be more academic. And then we can say, well, which of these interviews actually carried the most signal and why? And we're tracking all of that, right? And our users know this. Every interview gets recorded. So we have all the audio. We have time-stamped, when they run the code and when they write the code. So everything is there. And I think it's a matter of time till we're able to make some really good statements about what's working and what's not working, and hopefully make some changes in this industry. But we also can't do it prematurely because nobody cares what you think. The way to do this is to hire for the big companies and then hopefully try to make some change from them.
My grandfather, who passed away already, but he once told me that the first several years you work for the reputation, and then the reputation works for you. So
that's a great expression.
It's in Russian. So you are still working out your reputation, but at some point, hopefully, you'll be able to turn that into actual change in the industry. And of course, you mentioned the data that you collect, and that's exactly the reason why I'm so excited here. We're just talking about interviewing IO, but I really think that the data that you collect and share in your blog posts, either on your personal blog before the interviewing IO or now on the interviewing IO blog, that's just an amazing insight. And you could say I'm metrics freak. I like metrics. And some people just hate that about me. And my wife suffers a little bit from that. But I like metrics, and I like seeing like proofs for claims. And you've actually used the data from interviewing IO, the data that you mentioned, to infer some very, very interesting conclusions, let's say, or theories, hypotheses at the very least. And I would like to get into them, but just one point that you mentioned that struck me very interesting to discuss. I didn't know that you actually hire people to perform these mock interviews. I kind of assumed that the same people who interview for the companies are the same people who interview for the mock interviews. So could you just speak a little bit about that, and maybe how many people you have? Do you need open position? Maybe someone who wants to complement their income and happens to love interviewing, doing an interview, how they can reach out to you and just offer their services.
Of course, yes. So here are our criteria for who can be an interviewer. And by the way, there's overlap, right? So what ends up happening is, let's say, we've hired for Amazon in the past. Over time, some of their official interviewers who conduct interviews on our platform are like, hey, actually, this is a cool thing to do. And then they become mock interviewers. So because it's engineers everywhere, there's a lot of movement between roles. So somebody who starts as an engineer who's practicing can also become an interviewer. Like a lot of the people that are practicing on our platform are senior engineers at FAANG, because these interviews are so hard and unpredictable that the very people that are qualified to conduct them are the people that need the practice. And that's...
and they also the people who know the value, the importance of these interviews. That,
exactly.
No matter what you do, it's what you can solve.
So our criteria for who can be an interviewer are, you have to have at least 4 years of software engineering experience. That's the absolute minimum. I think our current average is 8 years, but 4 is the minimum. You have to have conducted at least 20 interviews on behalf of a top-tier tech company. And what does top-tier tech company mean? Well, it's subjective. We have a spreadsheet where we list the companies that we think are top-tier companies.
What's the criteria? Is there a criteria, or you just like a...
It's a little bit fuzzy, right? Like the FAANGs are on that list, and then FAANG adjacent companies are on that list. So like the...
Is it like market, like market worth of company, or it's like a perception in the community?
I think it's mostly perception in the community, and like which companies are known to be very selective, really, right? So which companies are hard to get into. So Stripe is on that list. Square is on that list. Uber and Lyft are on that list. Companies like that. And those are the official rules. What we do is if somebody wants to be an interviewer, we ask them to do 2 probationary interviews on the platform first. And then somebody on our operations team will review those and make sure that they're providing great candidate experience, that they're providing really useful feedback. That's really, really important. And that as far as we can tell, they're well calibrated. That's a little bit harder to determine, but if it looks like things are good, we onboard them officially. And then we start tracking 2 metrics. So we have this giant dashboard that has every interviewer who's active, and then we have these metrics, 2 metrics for every interviewer. One is how well their candidates are rating them, because after every interview, not only does the interviewer leave you feedback, you're also reviewing your interviewer, kind of like Airbnb. And the other metric is their calibration. So we look at every candidate you interview, we look to see how well they've done in other practice interviews, and also, most importantly, how well they've done in interviews with companies. And if it looks like you're passing people that end up failing later, then that's a tick against you. And if it looks like you're failing everybody, that's not so good for us either. So I think we have it on a scale of -4 to 4, where 0 is perfectly calibrated. -4 is like way too strict, and 4 is way too lenient. So we're tracking all the stuff, and then we have a system that throttles effectively interviewers that are not performing well.
And how many of those you have? Mock interviewers? I mean, in the tens, hundreds, thousands.
Yeah, in our lifetime, we've had thousands. At any given point, there are hundreds that are active.
Wow. With such a strict selection process, there's probably an entire department dealing with just that.
Yeah, we have a few people that deal with just that, but it's so important. Like that's the value prop. Like there's so many different mock interview practice sites, and I think the reason that I think we're the industry leader. I'm going to say we're the industry leader. I think that's true. I think the big reason that we're the industry leader is because we are so strict about who can be an interviewer. That's not true on other platforms. You have to work at a top company, but a lot of other platforms have people that are more junior and they're not tracking quality the same way. And that's really important. So to answer your question, if somebody would like to be an interviewer for us, you can just email interviewers@interviewing.io. There's a lot of...
Have you considered changing your domain to something simpler?
So many times.
It's a great name, but it's just difficult to pronounce.
So many times. But what I realized, and I didn't think of this when I named the company, it's really nice to have your company name also be a URL, because then you're linked to for free. A lot of the time, it just turns into a link. Did not think of that, but yes, it's actually, if I were doing this again, I would certainly name it something different. We've tried to buy interviewing.com and interview.ai and whatever, and they're just way too expensive. But hey, if you're listening and you own those domains, email me. We can make a deal. So just email that list, and right now, honestly, unless you have very niche skills, we're always looking for mobile interviewers. That's a place where we need some help.
Oh. Do you allow remote workers?
Yes, of course. Yeah, it's very easy.
No, I mean, but I mean from other countries.
Yes.
Not from
Yeah. That's because they're contractors. It's easier. I think we have a list of countries that I forget all the legalities.
I don't know if you know that, but I'm Android developer. So
okay,
I'm
we need that.
Developer, content creator. I create courses.
Yeah. Okay. Well, no, we need some help with.
Can we count this as an interview?
No.
Shit.
But if this is a proxy for how good of an interviewer you are, then I'm very optimistic. I'll say that.
But seriously, it's just amazing to hear. I'm glad that I asked this question because actually the quality of interviewers, I would say that's one of the, if not the most important criteria for something like you do. Because really, in my experience, a good interviewer and a bad interviewer is it's like hell and heaven approximately. That's the level of difference when you're in the hands of a good interviewer. Even if you bomb it, a good interviewer is so much better at giving you
you come out of it feeling like you learned something at that point.
Exactly.
Right. And you don't feel defeated. You're like, okay, that was a nice experience of solving a problem together. I can do better next time. That's how you're supposed to feel at the end of an interview.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a great segue into one of the questions that I wanted to ask you for a very, very long time. One of the blog posts that you wrote was about gender bias in tech recruiting. And this is a very, it's called
a hot topic.
Hot topic, yeah. It's a topic that many people wouldn't like to get into, but since I'm not, it's a hot topic in the United States, but since I'm not in the United States,
all bets are off. All right, yeah, let's do it.
I'll make it. I'll take this leap. So basically, your hypothesis going into this was that not hypothesis. Sorry, you saw the data, and if I recall correctly, you saw that male interviewees are doing much better on your platform than female ones.
Yes.
So you wanted to investigate that, and you have all this data available for you. And by the way, do you perform this analysis yourself? Are you a data scientist as well, or you're
I'm like an armchair. I've actually found that most of the analysis that we've had to do. I have a few advisors who are real data scientists, and I will send stuff to them and say, is this going to make me look like an idiot when I publish it? And sometimes they say yes, and sometimes they say no. So I always have a professional either, and some analyses are completely over my head, and then I need to bring in the big guns. A lot of the analyses, honestly, that we've done require a high school degree. We had a really good biology class in my high school, and they taught us about statistical significance in that class.
In the high school?
Yeah, and I was like, okay. And honestly, that gets you 80% of the way there. But I always have somebody that's eminently more qualified. But I've learned a few tricks over the years too.
I would say a couple of tricks. So basically, you saw that discrepancy. That if I recall correctly, that was that male interviews did much better, significantly better on your platform, and you wanted to investigate why. So please take it from here and maybe explain to us what you did.
Thank you. So we did see that. That was absolutely happening. And I was curious why that was. Now, around the same time, and it wasn't for this reason, but around the same time, we had built a real-time voice modulator internally. And this, I think one of the companies we were working with had asked for it. It was Yelp. And we're like, okay, yeah. Yelp
I really like that you're so free to name companies.
I hope it doesn't bite me. I think this one I'm allowed to name. So yeah, I was working with Yelp. They asked if we could build a voice modulator, and it seemed like a cool thing to do. So we did it. And in real time, we could make women sound like men and men sound like women. Now, that seemed like a cool experiment to do. So for some amount of time on our platform, before your interview, we would ask you to enroll in this experiment. And we had 3 groups. So we had a control group, so it didn't change anything. Then we had the first treatment group, so when you modulate somebody's voice, it inevitably ends up sounding a little bit robotic. So even if you don't change the pitch, just if you run it through the modulator, it's going to come out sounding not completely natural. Mm-hmm. So we wanted to make sure that if we modulated people's voices, that the robotic thing wouldn't be off-putting, or if it were, that it would be controlled for. So we had a group where we didn't change the pitch, but where we just kind of ran them and made the voices sound processed. And then we had the second treatment group where we made women sound like men and made men sound like women. And or actually, I'm trying to remember. It may have been that we just made everybody sound like a man, but I think we made men sound like women as well. I'm gonna go with that, and then if I'm wrong later.
As far as I remember, you did make men sound like women.
Yeah, I think we did. So what we were trying to see here is obvious, right? It's like, hey, when you make a woman sound like a man, is she going to be passing interviews more often than she was before? And when you make a man sound like a woman, is he going to be passing interviews less often? And we saw that there was no difference. It did not make a difference. And that was great. Like I was worried about whether we had some kind of unconscious bias among our interviewers on the platform, at least in our selection of interviewers. And again, we've talked already about how strict we are. It could be that we're very good at selecting interviewers, and it could be that out in the real world, this is a real bias, right? Absolutely could be. I don't know. But on our platform, didn't seem to be the case. But then that didn't answer the question. That didn't answer the question of why women were actually performing worse.
Because that was given. You saw in the data that women were performing worse. So you had this hypothesis that, well, it's not your hypothesis. It's actually like someone from looking at the US labor market from outside. It's like the prevailing hypothesis. It's like an axiom at some point that people just take for granted.
Like that's just a fact. Well, at least on our platform,
and you tested this assumption, and you did not find the data support that. You did not find bias in either direction. You saw that pretty much women and men are treated equally.
Yep, that's right.
So you wanted to find why.
I wanted to find out what was going on. I'm like, well, are women worse coders? I guess it's like I'm open to all possibilities, right? I try to go into it with an open mind. That would have been a harder blog post to write. Spoiler, we did not find that women are worse coders, but was very open to, just what will the data tell us? And when I dug into it, what I found is that after one bad performance on the platform, women are, I think, 7 times more likely to quit and not come back than men. So once you correct for that, right? If you take out all the quitters from the population of men and all the quitters from the population of women, then this disparity in performance goes away entirely. So it's just like the distribution of women was a little bit bottom heavy in a way because it had a lot of people that did poorly and then left. So that was a better post to write, but I was very happy to do it because I think it drew attention to something really, really important, which is that women are leaving both if you can't pass these interviews, right, then a lot of doors are closed to you. And if you can just kind of get over that hump and just not give up and practice for a few months, then you could really elevate your career. So I wanted to shine a light on the fact that this is happening. And what can we do, right? What interventions can we make to make women quit less? And, it was funny. When we first got this result, I remember one of the engineers on our team was like, well, have you ever tried to date as a man? Like, of course we're not going to quit, right? That's what we do. We're trained to just keep trying and keep trying and keep trying. And I don't know if that's why. I'm not going to speculate as to why this is, but I hope that just sharing that information makes women who see it think twice and makes them just keep going a little bit longer, because it does get better once you do it for a little while.
If I would sum it in simple word, the difference was not in the ability, the difference was not in the bias of the interviewers, but the difference was in the, let's call it, persistent in the face of rejection or bad result.
Yes, exactly.
So men are like, we have thicker skin, we are more aggressive by nature, let's say. Another hypothesis, but I think it's pretty reasonable to assume that we are more aggressive and more thicker skin. And therefore, when we get bad results, we do not give up. And this is like a numbers game, right? The more interviews you go through, the better you become. So if you leave too early, you just don't reach the point where you become good. And so there were too many women who would, not too many, but there were more women who would leave the process earlier before they get to the stage that they are like good. And men, because they can take a hit, they're like, okay,
all right, I'm just gonna dust myself off and exactly. Try again. And
I've been rejected by women many times. So what an interview makes difference? What does it make? Like it's much simpler than being like, oh no, you're not good enough.
Yeah, and so we found that there's actually an inflection point, and of course everybody's journey is different, but on average there's an inflection point after about 5 practice interviews. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Not always, right? It depends where you start, but in a pretty large data set, that's
on average. I think it's so important. Like your data shows that you become good at interviewing after 5 interviews.
Yeah, not necessarily on average, good, but you're gonna do better on average. Like there will be some kind of jump.
Okay, there's some step function of your ability to pass interviews after 5. So
yes,
folks out there, 5 rejections, that's what you should aim for. Until you get 5 rejections, you do not quit. If you got 5, then, well, maybe you're just bad coder. Sorry for that. No, I'm just joking.
You said not me.
Yeah. No, I actually think, and you will know that better than me, but in business, it's the same, right? Persistence is the key factor. The ability to take a punch and not back down, the ability to to be knocked down, but not knocked out. That's what it takes to.
And there's something interesting about the number 5 as well. So one of the other people on our team, our developer advocate, Kevin, had previously worked at other companies where they collected similar data. One of them was Pathrise and one of them was TripleByte. And they had found similar things. In their case, it wasn't necessarily mock interviews, but I think it was on-sites. It's like how many on-sites does somebody need to fail at before there's sort of a jump in performance? And they also came up with the number 5. So it's not just us. There's something about that number. And 5 is a lot. Like messing up 5 times is really, really painful. It's not trivial. It can be months of failure before you.
But still, it's so important for folks to know. I think it's super important to know that 5 is the inflection point. So basically, you must not quit before 5. And I know many people. I don't know if it's in the US the same, but in Israel, many people they finish some degree or complete some course, let's say some boot camp, and they go trying to interview, go try to get a job, fail 1, 2, 3 interviews, and they just quit, go to another career. And I think that knowing about this number 5 is it's not very good if you will drop after 5, but since so many people drop before 5, it's very important to know that at least 5, give yourself these 5 interviews. At the very least, that's what you owe yourself.
I think the last thing I'll say about it is, after I wrote that post and while I was writing it, I started thinking about, well, an interview is an interview, but if we think of what an interview actually is, it's kind of an attrition event, right? It's something where you have a bad experience and it makes you quit. And, a lot of companies in the US care so much about, or at least they say they care so much about gender diversity and other types of diversity and getting gender parity, right? Like we want 50% men and 50% women in engineering, and most of them are so far from that. But the problems start much earlier. By the time you get to college, something like, I don't know, I don't remember the exact number, but maybe 20% of computer science majors are women, right? So you're already starting at a pretty unlevel playing field. And I think a lot of these attrition events are happening to women much earlier. Like maybe they're happening in elementary school when they're studying math and they have a bad teacher, right? And you have one of these and they're out. And it's unfortunate. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done across a lot of different mediums before we can actually see gender diversity. It's not an easy solution.
Of course. And even the nature of work that should be done, or maybe nothing should be done, maybe that's the way. It's a very tough psychological, social, political question, but just knowing the data that you shared, I think it's just very important to understand the data and where the problem not problem. Where this effect comes from, and I think this hypothesis is very likely true that you shared. Okay.
Switching gears.
Out of my 100 questions, we just answered one. Well done. another 2 weeks on this podcast, and we've covered everything. No, but okay, I'll choose one that I'm very interested in. So you let your candidate, your interviewees choose the language that they use when they go for interviewing, right? That's right. A very interesting aspect of your platform, that you actually don't have to learn anything. You can just choose the language. And then you probably have some database of proficiencies of the interviewers, so you could match someone who...
I'll just be honest, we don't even do that. We just... you get matched, and hopefully the interviewer can figure it out. Most of the time they can figure it out. We've had cases where a candidate will choose some obscure functional programming language, right? And then the interviewer is like, they've never seen like Haskell before, and they're like, what is happening? And then the candidate has to talk them through it. But in practice, that doesn't happen that often. I think like our top 3 languages are, and I don't remember the order, but it's Java, JavaScript, and Python. And
surprising.
Not surprising, right? So all of our interviewers have at least seen those and can read code. But that's what happens in real life too at top tier tech companies. You pick your language, and then hopefully your interviewer has seen it. And if not, they'll be like, what does this mean? And then you have to explain what that weird thing means.
Yeah, and the question, let's say that's the most important question in this podcast. You have the data, you have a lot of data, and you look at it. The best candidates, which programming language they choose?
I think we actually wrote this on Twitter recently, and I don't remember, but I think it might be. Do you remember?
No. I don't. I honestly don't know an answer to this question. On Twitter, I'm going to search.
I think we can. If we pause the recording, or even if not, I'll go find it. I want to say it's probably like Rust or something like that. But there's so few people that do interviews in Rust. It's certainly not Python. But here, let me see if I can actually find the answer.
Yeah, let's spend
a minute.
I'll just explain what Rust is, because it's really not that very known language. And I never coded in Rust, but as far as I understand, it's some successor to C and C++. It's a relatively low-level language, which nevertheless allows a little bit more safety than C and C++ do. And it's relatively, I think in my world, in Android world, just recently it was announced that some parts of Android open source project will be written and supported to write in Rust. So this language definitely becomes more popular by day, but still it's relatively niche. So, and I wouldn't be surprised to find out that the best candidates use actually Rust.
Yeah, actually, so I found we have a dashboard of like little quick bites that we post on Twitter. So fortunately, I found it. Programming languages with the best performance. I was right. It's Rust.
Rust, number 1. Yes. So Rust coders, you are the best.
You are the best.
Do you have the second and the third place?
Yes. The second one, actually, you might like this. The second one is Kotlin.
You don't understand what you just did. I'm one of the biggest critics of Kotlin in the Android world. Okay, folks, I am humiliated, and I take everything, all the criticism I said about Kotlin back. The best developers coding Kotlin. Okay, I won't argue with data. And the third one?
Third one is Haskell. I was making fun of it earlier, but yeah, it's Haskell. Actually, so people who code in,
what's the worst one?
Yeah, let me find we don't even show the worst one. Let me modify this query. Hold on. All right. So the worst one, go ahead.
No, if you have the worst one.
I have it. Worst one is Objective-C.
Oh my God. Oh my God, you've just ruined years of my efforts to undermine all this new programming. Okay, Objective-C is basically the legacy language for iOS development, which was replaced by Swift, which is like very similar to Kotlin. And in Java, in Android, we used to use Java, and Kotlin was replaced that. So Kotlin developers are very good according to the data, and you cannot argue with that. My followers will love this podcast so much. It's just like invalidates
everything.
I don't know, years of my criticism.
It looks
and
like,
the other two language is
let me put this in perspective real quick. So it looks like Kotlin developers pass interviews at more than 2x the rate of Objective-C developers.
And if you compare that to Java?
Java is actually kind of right in the middle. So Java is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, top 8. So Java is number 8. And
relatively to Java developers, how much better Kotlin developers are?
Kotlin about 20%.
20%. Okay, it's not a huge effect, but it's a very sizable effect. Okay, thank you very much for.
I'm glad I could find that.
For ruining my trick, but. Yeah, I mean, like when I criticize, it's a long story, so not for that. But people actually constantly say that I'm a grifter and I try to attract attention with my criticism and stuff. So now I will just need to shut the fuck up. That's it, folks. I've been defeated by data, by Aline with interviewing IO.
By data, it's with honor, you know.
Yeah, exactly. I take the L from data. That's fine. But I was just mentioned that it's very interesting that Kotlin is very interesting, but the other two languages are Haskell and Rust. They're relatively rare and niche. So there's something to be said about developers who actually go into lengths and invest their time to learn this language, and they're not simple. That's also. No. Rust is a low-level language. Haskell is a functional language. So one of those that you mentioned that when standard average developers look at it, they're just like, what the fuck is that?
Yeah.
So there's probably some correlation between people who are like very good and people who just want to learn these relatively new tools.
I think that's right. And also in fairness, our sample sizes for those are a lot smaller, right? So, with languages like Java, we have tens of thousands of people that are doing it. With Rust, it might be in the hundreds of people. So we'll caveat that. So don't feel like you fully lost. It might be that the data is not entirely reliable.
Yeah, I'm very, very grateful to you for trying to save my grades, but we both know that in the hundreds it's still statistically significant, probably so. I'll just take the L, it's fine. All right, thanks for sharing with us the statistics related to the programming languages. I think that's very interesting and insightful. The next topic that I'd like to bring up is, what do you think about LinkedIn certifications and endorsements? So could you please...
I would be delighted to speak about this. Thank you for choosing this question. I think they're stupid and bad. And we have data that shows that they're stupid and bad. So I think people all suspect that they're stupid and bad because a lot of what LinkedIn does in general is stupid and bad.
Yeah, I never endorsed anyone on LinkedIn. I never put a certificate on LinkedIn. And I sell courses and people ask me, I sell on Udemy, they're like, the certificate is generated automatically, and I have my own platform where students ask me like, "Can we get a certificate?" And I just the feeling of issuing a certificate to a student, something was off-putting for me. So
you just don't. I love that you don't do that. I love that you took a stand on that. Well, I think you're doing the right thing, both for your brand and for your students, because. So I'll talk about certifications first, and then I'll talk about endorsements because they're a little bit different. So certifications are the official things you can put on your profile, whether it's like some kind of Microsoft A+ certification or Udacity. I used to work at Udacity, right? So like Udacity has some of those where you completed a nano degree. I think that's what they call them. And Udemy has them. And an endorsement is just another person being like, oh, Vasily is really good at Kotlin. My real estate agent endorsed me for JavaScript years ago. And at that point, I knew that endorsements were not the thing. But so certifications, they're over the years, a lot of people, both at the company, at Interviewing.io, and outside the company, like investors, have suggested that we come up with an Interviewing.io certification that people could put on their LinkedIn profiles. I am a top 10% whatever on Interviewing.io. And I always resisted doing that in the same way that I felt the same discomfort that it sounds like you felt. And I wanted to do a little bit of work and actually dig into the data. So with the help of one of our amazing data scientists, we looked at our users' LinkedIn profiles to see which of them had certifications, and then compared those certifications, those to their actual score on Interviewing.io. And we wanted to see if there's a relationship. Like, does having a certification on your LinkedIn profile make it more likely that you do poorly in interviews? That's the question we were trying to answer.
So you had, a priori, you had a hypothesis that there will be an inverse correlation between certifications and your performance.
Yes, and that is the case. I think we found that. I think like one certification was good, and that was the TripleByte certification, which was painful for me to say because they were our biggest competitor. They're not really around anymore, but at the time, but we published it because we publish truth. Every other certification was bad, every single one. And we looked at like HackerRank and I think Udemy we looked at. I mean, there's a graph in the post.
And by the way, everything we discuss, all the posts, they will be linked down there, so you can just go and read them. And I encourage the viewers to go and read that.
And you can see if I lied about anything too. We found that, and more importantly, even creating certifications, I think, is bad because the only people that tend to list certifications on their profiles are people that are from non-traditional backgrounds because they need something to stand out, right? People that
what
look
do you
good
mean by non-traditional?
So like they haven't worked at Google, they haven't graduated from Stanford. Like, at the beginning of the podcast, we talked about what recruiters do when they go on LinkedIn and they look for a very limited set of things. So the people that don't have that limited set of things are the ones that are more likely to put certifications on their profiles.
You don't have something meaningful and great to tell about yourself, so you use certifications to replace that.
Yeah, and you end up with kind of this negative feedback loop because recruiters are already biased, right? So they're looking for Google, Stanford, MIT, Meta. Those people don't usually list the certifications because they're already getting bombarded by recruiters left and right.
Yeah.
So recruiters start to see certifications only on profiles that they're biased against. So then over time, in their minds, even if the certification is valuable, which most aren't, but even if it is valuable, recruiters create this sort of negative visceral association with the certification. And now you've shot yourself in the foot because the certification is doing the exact opposite thing that you want it to do. And most certifications are bad. So like it's sort of from two angles. It's a bad thing to do, and I think it's a bad thing for companies to do. Because
this puts me in a little bit uncomfortable position again because I have courses on Udemy, and occasionally someone on LinkedIn will just post their certificate that they got from one of my courses, tag me, and thank you, Vasi. And it's like I want to tell them, don't do that. It looks very, very cheap, and it looks very very.
It's like, what are you trying to compensate for?
It smells desperation. But on the other hand, as the instructor who kind of sold them their discourse, I need to like it and write several encouraging words. So
it's tough.
Again, this game theory race to the bottom.
Exactly right. So it's a painful thing for it to be true because you want to give people that are non-traditional, especially when they're excellent, a way to stand out. Certifications are not it. There's a different way, and maybe it's us, like we're trying to solve that problem. Maybe somebody else is going to solve that problem, but I don't think that problem is going to be solved with certifications. Endorsements are similar. So we did a similar thing. We again looked at LinkedIn profiles of our users, found how many endorsements they had or if they had endorsements and tried to correlate that with their interview performance. And again, same result. Like those endorsements are not valuable.
Amazing. So folks, don't put certifications on LinkedIn, don't endorse and don't ask for endorsement. That's the cringiest one, when people whom you either don't know or maybe barely know write to you and ask for endorsement. Sometimes in the areas where you have zero experience.
I think endorsements are LinkedIn's way of like tagging profiles with things that people might be interested in ads about, right? That's what endorsements are for.
Or maybe it's like a feature for not for the outside world, but for the people who endorse and get endorsement. It's like some
it's
social,
an engagement thing,
exactly.
Which again for LinkedIn is they just want to keep people engaged longer so they can show them more ads, right? LinkedIn is not a hiring platform. It's an ad platform, and it's a platform for recruiters to search for people ineffectively and keep paying LinkedIn to search ineffectively because they feel like they're making progress. Like those are the two ways LinkedIn makes money.
Trashing competitors, checked. No, but they're not your competitors. So.
I mean, they do like when we go to companies and we try to get budget. The biggest budget that we're fighting with, like every company has set aside, $100,000 or more for LinkedIn, and then everything else comes out of this tiny little thing. So yes, we are invested in LinkedIn not being successful. LinkedIn would not say we're their competitor; they don't give a shit about us, but we give a shit about them.
You are not competitor on the product; you are competitor on the budget.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay, we're running out of time, but since we mentioned certifications and since we mentioned endorsements, just the last piece of data that I would like you to share with the listeners, and you can do it as briefly as you want. What's the important stuff about resumes that people should get right if they want their resumes to be passed to the hiring managers, to pass this HR filter?
I know what you want me to say, and I'll say the thing you want me to say, but I'll say something. I'll say something else before I say the thing.
Because when I read that, it was so surprising.
Well, okay, I'll say the thing you want me to say first because it's true, but then I'll caveat it.
Okay.
So years ago, when I was working in-house as a recruiter, head of recruiting, I did this sort of little experiment where I looked at all the resumes we had gotten over the course of a year and looked at which ones had ended up getting an offer. And then I came up with a bunch of different features, right? So everything from where the person has worked and gone to school, those are obvious, to whether they had a GitHub profile, to whether they had an email on their own domain, to how many programming languages they knew, to how many typos and grammatical errors they had on their resumes. So yeah, I sat around every night for like hours counting typos and grammatical errors. And what I found was that, right, how many typos and grammatical errors people had was the biggest predictor of whether they would end up getting an offer or not.
Yeah, so not the school you went to, not your work experience, just the basic grammatical correctness of your resume.
Yeah, now where you worked still mattered, right? It mattered,
but by a lesser degree.
Much, by a lesser degree. There were only three things that mattered. It was typos and grammatical errors. It was where you worked previously. And then the third one was, and this is rather subjective, but how succinctly and clearly you can actually describe what you worked on. So I think the example I gave in the post is if someone's like, I use the software development lifecycle to create pleasing features for users. It's like, I don't know what you did. Versus, exactly. I worked on this feature, I moved this metric, this is why this feature mattered to the business, and this was my part. Like I was on a team, I did this specific part of it.
If I'll need to summarize that in few words, it's just like basically stop listing keywords and technologies on your resume. Just
you might still have to like maybe put them
on
the
on the side. Yeah, exactly.
Because depending on where you apply, right? If there's an automatic filter, you might not get through if you don't have that stuff listed. But yeah, list it at the bottom. Like, this is the stuff that I know. Great.
So you need to pass these filters that check keywords checked. So just list them somewhere on your resume. But when you describe your work experience, do not list the technologies. Just plainly explain what you built
did and why it mattered. Yeah, that's it. With that, the caveat I wanted to say before we get off the topic is resumes are such a bad and flawed document. Most of the time, even if this is the thing that actually matters, that's not what recruiters are looking for. Like, what they're really looking for is, did you work at a company I've heard of, and did you go to a school that I've heard of? And if you didn't, you can have the best resume in the world and you might still not get in because the system is broken. And that's what we're trying to fix. But also try not to have typos and grammatical errors. And yes, it's very good to try to succinctly explain what you did and why it mattered.
Yeah, and I will caveat your caveat with, again, something that we said at the beginning of this podcast, that your company is primarily targeted towards the bigger players in the field. So the recruiters, they're actually, if you work, let's say, at Microsoft, you look for candidates who worked at similarly sized companies. But for startups, they usually, they might want someone who worked at Google or Netflix, but it's not as important for smaller companies, probably. Just an assumption.
Depends on the company, but yes, there are certainly companies. Theory. Some of them actively don't talk to people from those companies because they think they can't afford them, or they think that those people can't do startups, right? That they're so used to being at a big company and they can't actually get shit done. So that
I know this sentiment. Heard it several times. I've been on the other side, on the recruiting side of some of the anecdotes, in my opinion, of people who can't do anything because they are been in a big company in a very small niche.
Yeah.
Anyways. I have so many more questions to ask you and so many more topics to discuss. And I really encourage everyone to just go and read Interviewing.io blog, your personal blog as well. I think you stopped posting on your personal blog?
I sometimes post stuff that I think is controversial and is like not the company's opinion. It's like, Aline thinks this.
Forget about Interviewing.io blog. Yeah. The interesting stuff. All the links will be in the description for this podcast. And I think it was a blast, Aline. I think the knowledge that you've just shared, and if someone, especially for people who who just start their career or they are at the very beginning of their career, these seemingly small pieces of information, if you take them to heart and you act on them, this can spare you months and years and can actually get you into the place that you want to be, as opposed to a place where you don't want to be. So really, thank you very much for taking the time and sharing with us all your
Thank you. This was one of my favorite podcasts that I've done. You've asked such great questions. It was a joy. Thank you for the opportunity.
Folks, thank you for tuning in and listening, and all the materials will be down there. Thank you, Aline, once again, and until next time, goodbye.